Hi everyone and welcome. In this video tutorial I will try to explain how clusters work inside Maya and how those can be really helpful if you want to control a set of vertices of specific objects here in Maya or any kind of deformers. So let's go in and start discovering the wonders of working with clusters. So to illustrate this much more effectively, I will go in and create a sphere object here inside Maya, and let's say for instance that you want to drive specific set of vertices here. So let's first grab the vertices that we want to control using the cluster. So I think this is going to be a good selection here to illustrate the process and how clusters work. Next, with our selection here, we can go to the deform, and here's the cluster deformer that I'm talking about. So you can go in, click on the square here to grab the settings of our cluster option. Let's make sure we reset the settings so you can see the default settings that we get initially. By default, we get a non-relative cluster. By that we mean the cluster, when it is going to be parented to another object, is going to be creating some additive deformations, and that's not always a good thing, since we want sometimes that the deformations, we want them to be preserved and not be added by any means. So at many scenarios we want to work with a relative cluster. To show you the non-relative cluster here, let me first go in and uncheck this here to illustrate the problem that can happen. So I will leave the settings here set to the default and click on the create. So the Maya, when we create a cluster, it is going to provide us with this handle here. So this handle, when we start moving that handle around, make sure to enable the wireframe on shaded here to see the wireframe of your object. You can see just moving the cluster handle, I'm able to move the entire set of vertices that I have just added to the cluster. So how cool is that? So this is how clusters work inside Maya. They are an easy way to create handles to drive a specific set of vertices, and this also can have many different benefits, and you will see that shortly. So this is now how the clusters work. Okay, so this looks pretty good. Also, if you go to the attributes editor by hitting the Control A, you can see that if we go to the handle shape node, I have many different fields here. So this one is for the X, the Y, and the Z axis. If I start middle mouse and drag in here, I'm able to adjust the handle position without affecting its pivot point. So if I go, for example, and if I'm not able to select, for example, my handle here easily, I can go into this handle shape under my cluster and I can adjust that here, for example, to move it a little bit out, and now you can see that I'm able to select it and grab it much more easily, right? But the pivot point is still right at the same initial position, which is very cool. So just the handle which has moved here for easy selection. So super great. Now the problem that I have talked about, the additive deformations that we can get using the clusters. Let's say for instance that this is the effect that we want to get from the clusters. So I have transformed my cluster here. I have plugged in some values under my cluster transformation fields, and so now this is the position, or this is the effect that I want to get. However, if I go in and add another cube object, I will move this here to the side, and let's say that we parent this cube here, this sphere, sorry, to this cube, and we want to preserve these kind of deformations. So what I think everyone will go ahead and do is just take this cluster and parent it under this object here, since this is going to be the parent and drive both objects together. However, using that non-relative options here, this one that I'm talking about. So if we use this and keep this unchecked, watch what's going to happen once my cluster is parented to another object. Take a look. I'm getting some weird transformations here. So we have some additive transformations which affect the deformations of my cluster. So this is kind of messing around with the deformations that I have created. So look carefully what we have got. So this is, I think this is not what we should be getting, and so this is a very good thing to take into consideration when working with clusters. You want to work with that relative option here. You want to check and activate the relative here to avoid that issue. So now if I take, for example, let me undo back and delete, for example, this cluster here, and let me create one from scratch. So I will go to the component mode of my sphere by hitting the F8 on my keyboard. If I select, grab few vertices like the one we selected previously. If I now, with the cluster options here still selected, let's make sure this time we turn the relative mode to on, and we create that. And if I now go in and, for example, use and parent using the same deformations we added previously, let's now parent our sphere again to my cube, and also we want to grab this cluster here and parent that to my cube as well. So watch this time the effect that we are going to get. We are not getting this time any kind of weird deformations like the one we had previously. So now we are preserving the same deformations that we applied using the cluster, which is super cool. Now we are getting a much more predictable result, and we can be now more safe using the cluster option and using that relative mode. So this is the benefits of using the relative mode against using the non-relative cluster. And if you want at any time to change, for example, the relative mode from the non-relative, just make sure to grab your cluster here, right? Make sure to grab it. It's a little bit tricky to select, and make sure to go to the attributes editor, and under the cluster node, here's the option, the relative option. So if you want at any time to change this, you can do that from here. Under the handle shape, you can again change the position of the handle for easy access and selection. All right, super cool. Let's now go in and discuss another topic about the clusters here. So let's first make sure to select another set of vertices here. These ones, for example. And again, I will create a cluster for this selection here using the same last options. Okay, so now I'm driving the set of points. Let's say, for example, that I want to add more points to my already existing cluster. So the way I will do that is very simple. Make sure you are, of course, selecting your cluster. So I will go in and try to move the shape or the handle of my cluster here outward a bit so I can grab it easily. And now if I go to the shaded view again, I can go in this time to the deform menu, and if I go to the edit membership tool, you will see the vertices that are being affected by my cluster here. So these are the vertices that are now controlled by the cluster, and I can go in and, for example, if I hit or hold the control key, I can click on the points that are already being selected, and Maya will go ahead and remove them from our selection. So now if I go into the cluster and try to move this, now you can see the results that this time we have got. So now just these points are being affected, and we have managed to remove the other two vertices from our selection using the edit membership tool. You can see the highlighted vertices are what being driven by the cluster. Alright, super cool. You have another option here to change the set of vertices that are being controlled, and that option is if you select, for example, your mesh here. Let's, for example, try to give another example here so that you can understand much further the benefits of using with clusters. Again, clusters doesn't just work with a selection of vertices of a 3D object. You can use that to control, for example, another deformer like the lattice deformer, and I'm going to select my mesh here and go to the component mode of my sphere, and I will go in and select few points here and add this time the lattice deformer. If you want to learn more about the lattice deformer, I have a video tutorial just dedicated for how the lattice deformer works here inside Maya, so feel free to check that out. And I'm gonna go ahead and reset my settings here, and I will go in and try to work with a value of 5 for my divisions here to get a higher resolution to control my vertices. And now you can see that if I go in and select my lattice deformer, I'm able to now create a cluster to deform these sets of points. So the lattice deformer works exactly like in objects here inside Maya. It also has these kind of points set to deform the object, and we can work with clusters and add the cluster here to drive the set of vertices. So here's how to do that. We can go to the deform with our points of the lattice deformer still selected. Let's go in and work with the same settings of the cluster and click on the create. Now you can see if I go into the attributes editor and move this in the Z axis a bit out so I can easily access and grab it, you can see the effect that I'm getting. So clusters are a wonderful option to use to save you a lot of time when selecting objects, and they have many different uses when it comes to rigging, animation, and pretty much anything here inside Maya. So they are a lot of effective choice to work with. Alright, super cool. Alright, great. You can also use another option here to see the kind of influence that the clusters and other kind of deformers have over a certain object inside Maya. So the way to do that, if I go and select my mesh here, you can see that it is now deformed by the cluster here as well as the lattice deformer. If I select my object and if I go to the all the way down to set membership here, and if I click on that, let's make sure to double click on the tool here, you can see that my objects now, I'm getting just like the scanning method or the scanning tool, I'm now able to paint the influence of my deformers that they have on my mesh here. So we have a set or a selection of deformers here. So we have the cluster. Once I click on the cluster, you can see now the vertices that are being affected by here, and we have three kind of operations to take into consideration. If you want to add a specific vertex, for example, to this cluster control, just make sure to paint over that vertex, and right away you can see that it kind of recolored with a orange color and it gets added to my selection. Okay, the same thing here, we have an FFD deformer, and once I select that, I'm able to add, if I want to add many points here to be driven by the lattice deformer, or I can use the remove here and I can remove these sets of points. For example, if I remove these now and if I go in and select, for instance, the cluster here, let's see if those points are being affected. You can see that now they are not any longer affected by the cluster here. Here is those points that I have painted or removed from my FFD control. So now I'm just controlling these three vertices here, which is kind of cool. And here on the other side, if I start moving these sets of vertices, I'm now also able to drag these two here, which I have added using the edit membership tool here. It is the one all the way the set membership here. So make sure to grab your mesh first and then go all the way down and select this last option here, set membership tool, and it will list every deformer that is controlling and linked to your mesh. So pretty good stuff, right? Also, the benefits of using a cluster here is that I can get some overlapping deformations. So here's what I mean by that. You can see that this cluster here is driving these sets of points here. If I zero my cluster here to a value of 0, let's make sure that I'm typing in 0 here, and you can see that if I go and select or see the influence of my cluster here, if I go in and grab the cluster, I can use the edit membership tool, this one this time here. If I click on that by selecting first the cluster, here is the points that are being affected. Well, let's say for example that I want to select these 3 points here and control those using another cluster. So I will go first and select my mesh here, and here's the 3 points that I want to select, and I can go in and add another cluster for that. And let's make sure to position the handle a bit out so I can easily grab and select that. Right, so something like this. Now you can see if I start working with this new cluster here, alright, take a look. So this is a different kind of behavior than the ones that we can get using, for example, joints. So if you do, for example, want to control your object using joints and skinning, you will not get this overlapping behavior here. You will get a kind of blend between one bone objects and another bone objects. However, this is not the case here. So I'm able to get an overlapping behavior. I can control those set of vertices using this cluster handle here, and if I, for example, want to select this one here and select the set related and linked to that cluster, I'm able also to select the same vertices here that are being controlled with this one here and also drive them as well. So I'm getting a overlapping here. I'm able to drive those using this cluster and also using this one here. So this is the overlapping action or overlapping behavior that we can get using the clusters here, and we can control that using the component editor. So if I go to the Windows under the general editor, if I grab the component editor inside Maya is going to be useful for a lot of things, not just skinning, which is very popular to use the component editor for. However, this time we will use the weighted deformer section here. And for example, if I go in and select those 3 vertices that are being controlled by both clusters, let's first switch to the component mode, and let's now expand this little triangle here to see the weights that these points are having. You can see that we are not getting a blend. However, we are getting one value in both the cluster 1, so this is the cluster 1 and this is the cluster 3, so we are getting a 1. That means that we are able to both control these vertices using both controls, and we can get an overlapping action. So this is the kind of behavior that we have just seen. However, you can go in and, for example, drop down the value of the cluster 3 here, this one here, for example, to just control these vertices by a 0.5 value. If I go in and do that, I can drop in the control of my new cluster here, and it is not going to have much influence. You can see now that we are only controlling those vertices using a 0.5 value, which is not a very big amount of control. However, if I control them using this cluster here, it has full control or a value of 1 over those vertices, and I'm able to move them fully or control them fully using this one. This one here again, now since it has just a 0.4 value, it has just a little influence over those points. So you can think of this now, how you can use this for pretty much anything. You can create pretty much anything here inside Maya using these kind of setups, and you can create some stunning setups and behaviors either for the rigging process or the animation process or anything you would like here inside Maya. So this is why it is going to be important to sit down for a moment and try to grasp even more the clusters here and how to work with them in conjunction with the lattice deformers here and in conjunction with other deformers here. So feel free to go in and sit down and play around with the clusters and try to understand how they work and how to use them effectively in your workflow.